Okay, everybody, let's conquer us some thyroid. I'm Dr. Bragleski. That's me on the left there. That is my wife, Mandy, Dr. Mandy on the right. And that's our little daughter, Kendall, in the middle. So let's dive right in and talk about some thyroid issues here. It's estimated that about 30% of the United States population has thyroid dysfunction, and 68% of that is undiagnosed, meaning these people are walking around with a thyroid problem or a condition that they're not aware of, and they are just going about their daily life. 80% of those thyroid issues and the thyroid dysfunction that we see today is estimated to be autoimmune in nature. And we're going to talk about why that's important. Autoimmune issues are very much on the rise today, and we're going to talk about why that may be the case as well, and how to remedy that. So where are we going during this webinar? We're going to talk about the physiology of the thyroid, how it works. I think that's important in understanding what certain conditions are, as well as how your doctor may choose to treat them. We're definitely going to talk about the main contributors to thyroid dysfunction, perhaps some that you're not aware of, especially when we get into the realm of toxicity. We're going to talk about why our blood work may be normal despite having, all the same symptoms of thyroid issues, say trouble losing weight, hairs falling out, low energy, thinning skin, the whole 9 yards, everything that most people experience when they have a thyroid problem. And we're really going to talk about what the real problem is, and then we obviously need to talk about testing as well and figure out what kind of testing is best. So what are the different signs and symptoms that we have, say, an underactive or a hypothyroid gland? One is unexplained weight gain, or termed a different way, weight loss resistance. The thyroid gland is our master metabolism gland, and you can see that if it runs our metabolism, that if we have a underactive thyroid, it may result in a lower or a slower metabolism, resulting in weight gain, despite seemingly changing our diet, changing our exercise habits, and we still resist that weight loss. So we're going to talk about why that is in a little while, and why your thyroid gland may be contributing to that. Constant fatigue and tiredness. Our thyroid, again, it's our master metabolism gland, and it's responsible for our energy production. More importantly, actually, our cellular energy production. So if our thyroid gland isn't on par, or above par, or below par, I should say, if you're a golfer, then having an underactive thyroid can certainly leave you at risk for things like chronic fatigue and low energy, and things of the sort, brain fog. Muscle soreness and pain is another sign that you may have an underactive thyroid. Again, I touched on briefly before at the start of this webinar that 80% of thyroid issues can be autoimmune in nature. And unfortunately, that means that the body's attacking itself, or more importantly, the immune system is attacking itself. And autoimmune conditions like to come in pairs. So say, for instance, someone has a Hashimoto's thyroiditis condition, which is an autoimmune underactive thyroid gland. Very often, those people will present with, say, muscle and joint pain, things like rheumatoid arthritis or even psoriatic arthritis. Those are other autoimmune conditions that attack the joints of the body. So you can have more than one autoimmune condition, but express it in different ways. Say, for instance, with the thyroid first, and then maybe down the road with the joints and connective tissue later. Menstrual infertility problems is a big topic with thyroid problems. With that, the reason that is because you'll see here on the next slide that generally the thyroid is run by the pituitary hypothalamus, which is an area in your brain that's kind of the master controller of all your hormones. But when you have a high amount of activity going on in the pituitary gland, where the thyroid hormone essentially starts, you can get high activity of other hormones as well that may be antagonistic to getting pregnant, say like prolactin. So There's an area in your brain, in your pituitary, that secretes both TSH, which you've probably heard of and we will talk about, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, in addition to prolactin. Believe it or not, prolactin is, some of you may guess, the hormone that's responsible for producing breast milk in women. And some of you may be of the notion that breastfeeding can act as a natural way of birth control. So if you have a high amount of pituitary activity going on, then you could potentially, by having, an autoimmune type of issue going on with your thyroid, you can be infertile because just the high amount of prolactin that your body's producing as a result. Dry and flaky skin is another issue that is commonly seen with an underactive thyroid. Reason being is because the thyroid hormone is actually responsible for making what's called our sebaceous glands. And the sebaceous glands are literally our oil production glands that we have all over our skin and our armpits, across our face. So if we have an underactive thyroid, we may not be producing enough sebum or sebaceous gland fluid to keep our skin nice and moist. High cholesterol levels can often be associated with an underactive thyroid because, in general, and I won't get into too much detail here, but the LDL receptor site that LDL cholesterol attaches to on cells, that receptor site for LDL is made, or at least contributed to, by thyroid hormone. So if you have a low level of LDL receptor on cells, then in your blood you may have actually a high level of LDL cholesterol because your cells just aren't taking up that cholesterol from the blood, which I will talk about here in a little while, as in differences between what's showing up in your blood versus what's actually going on inside the tissues. Poor concentration and memory is another one going on with underactive thyroids, and even moods. There's a lot of neurotransmitters that are produced as a result of thyroid hormone production. So again, if we have underactive thyroid, we can have poor mood, we can have poor memory, just because we're not producing the neurotransmitters needed to have an optimally functioning brain. So those are the most common signs and symptoms that most doctors will see clinically. Even me as a chiropractor, I'll see that as well. So let's move on here and talk about the physiology and how this thyroid thing works. So first, we have to understand that thyroid hormone doesn't just like magically appear, right? There's a process, as with anything in the body. First, what happens is TRH, which stands for thyroid releasing hormone, is released by the hypothalamus in your brain. So this is right in the center of the brain at the top, right up here. And as a result of that, that thyroid releasing hormone tells your pituitary just below to make TSH, which most of you have probably heard of, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. So once that TSH is produced from the pituitary, the anterior pituitary, that will tell our thyroid gland to start to make what's called T4, okay? So T4 is actually the precursor to T3. And one thing that we have to understand is that if you're going to get your blood work done, T4 is actually the inactive form of the hormone. So our cells cannot use T4. It's actually free T3, which is what our cells use and what expresses the thyroid hormone. So once your thyroid gland produces that T4, it has to get converted into T3. And 60% of that conversion, as you can see from the diagram here, is activated in the liver. And in addition to that, 20% more is activated in the intestines. So you can see that 80% of that conversion actually doesn't even happen in the thyroid. It happens in the liver and the gut. The remaining 20% of that T4 is actually converted into RT3, which stands for reverse T3. So reverse T3 is actually the antagonist of T3 itself. So if you think of T3, thyroid hormone, being the active form of the hormone and responsible for upregulating metabolism and upregulating energy. Our T3 or reverse T3 is the opposite of that. So it'll make you feel a little less energetic, a little more fatigued. So you can see I have T3 and RT3 down here at number 4. We tend to want to look at a ratio of that when you're getting your blood work, just to see, look, if your RT3 is high compared to your T3, or you're looking at a ratio of that perhaps. Your reverse T3 is high really when you're under a lot of stress, whether that be chemical, physical, emotional, or you're sick perhaps, things like that. So when your body's under some type of stress, RT3 is going to be high, and rightly so. It's trying to tell your body to slow down rather than speed up. So we have to slow down in order for our bodies to heal. So in general, we have this process. We have TRH being released from the brain, TSH being released from the pituitary to secrete T4 from the thyroid gland itself. And the big kicker here is that T4, the inactive form, has to be converted into its active form of T3. And that conversion happens down here in the liver and in the gut. So we have to understand as well that most medication that's being given out today is actually a synthetic or even a natural form of T4, or perhaps maybe even a combination. But you'll see here in a little bit that just because we're giving a bunch of T4 and maybe your T4 numbers look good on your blood, we have to get that T4 into T3 in order for it to have any type of positive effect on the body. So let's move on here. I hope that makes sense for you guys. And this is just another diagram harping on the point that TSH causes the thyroid gland to produce T4, which has to be converted into free T4, or free T3, I should say. So there's different types of thyroid disorders. There's what we call like a functional thyroid disorder, meaning the thyroid gland is okay, but it's just not making quite enough hormones. End result, you still don't feel well. There's autoimmune thyroid disorders like Hashimoto's, the hypo form of the autoimmune thyroid disorder, and Graves' disease, which is the hyper form of the thyroid disorder. In the autoimmune conditions, your thyroid is actually being damaged or attacked by your own immune system for various reasons. And again, the result's going to be you're probably not feeling well. In general, whether you're told it's in your head, whether you have a procedure, you're told you need a procedure done, the cause is generally not addressed in either case, because it's something that we feel like if we see a blood number, we have to reduce it, which isn't very sophisticated in my opinion, but in general, we have to start looking at what is actually causing this issue. So if we look at just a few examples here of what your blood work may look like, I think Hashimoto's would be probably the most common that hits home for most people. So if you were to get your blood work back for Hashimoto's thyroiditis, you would see that your TSH is likely high. So that essentially tells you that your brain or your pituitary is getting a message from your thyroid gland that it doesn't have enough thyroid hormone. So the brain is going to try to spit out more and more and more thyroid hormone, yet the autoimmune reaction that's going on at the thyroid gland is essentially not allowing that to happen. So you can have all this high pituitary activity in the form of high TSH telling your thyroid gland to produce all kinds of hormone, but it's just not going to do it because the cause is not necessarily that your thyroid gland isn't working, it's an immune response issue. So understand that these numbers are just kind of a snapshot in time. For example, if we go and look at generally subclinical mild hypothyroidism, which most people are probably walking around with, we're still going to get that signal that maybe our thyroid is not producing enough hormone. So our TSH is going to elevate a little bit from our brain. So our brain's like, hey, let's produce more thyroid hormone. And your free T4, free T3 may look normal, but in reality, we don't really know if those lab values are actually normal or if, more importantly, your cells are hearing that thyroid hormone. So understand the blood work isn't always, it's not always the best test. I mean, it certainly gives you a very good idea of what's going on, but it doesn't necessarily tell you everything, okay? So I think that we do need to hit on a topic called leaky gut syndrome, and the reason being is if we think back a second here and understand that some of that conversion of the inactive form of thyroid hormone T4 to the active T3, it happens inside the gut. So you can understand how most thyroid disorders, I feel, may not necessarily be a problem with the thyroid itself. It may be a problem with the conversion sites, namely the liver and the gut. So let's talk about the gut here. Some of you may have heard of leaky gut syndrome. It's essentially when we get these small holes poked inside the gut because of, say, toxins that we're exposed to, perhaps not eating the best of foods or the best quality of foods. I'm a big non-GMO organic proponent. If we're not doing that, we really are damaging the lining of our gut, and it's really only one cell layer thick, as you can see here. But what happens is we get these holes poked into our gut, and that allows bad guys to creep through, say bad bacteria, toxins, undigested food, namely proteins, and they get into our bloodstream. And once they get into our bloodstream, our immune systems essentially say, oh, this is not good, these guys are not supposed to be here, and they launch this immune inflammatory cascade, which the immune system's doing nothing wrong, it just sees something that's not supposed to be there and results in this autoimmune type of inflammatory reaction. So understand that because most thyroid disorders probably have an autoimmune component, and this goes for more than just thyroid disorders, this goes for other autoimmune conditions as well. If your gut is overly permeable and you're getting this inflammatory response from toxic foods or just environmental toxins that you're taking in, you're going to get this inflammatory response, which is never necessarily a good thing, especially when it goes on too long unchecked. So the gut plays a huge role at the end of the day. So factors that may affect your thyroid function, I'll just touch on the ones that I feel are most important here. So we'll start at the top left of the screen. So factors that contribute to proper production of thyroid hormones. I think the most important ones here would be iodine. Iodine is literally part of the hormone. Tyrosine is the amino acid precursor to the hormone. And you can get these in certain foods. Selenium is huge for converting that T4 to T3. So again, remember, most of the thyroid issues going on today is a conversion issue from the inactive form to the active form. So selenium is a huge player in that. You can get selenium from the very pleasantly smelling sardines, as well as Brazil nuts. Just eating some sardines on a relatively daily basis and eating some Brazil nuts throughout the week might be a good idea if you can stomach them. Otherwise, I would suggest getting a decently good quality supplement. Let's see, factors that increase that conversion of T4-3 to RT3, meaning RT3, remember, is responsible for lowering our cellular energy, lowering our metabolism because we are in a time of stress. As you can see there, stress is the #1 cause of a high RT3. So reverse T3, that is. So all those other things, toxins, we're going to touch on here in a little bit, and certain medications can do this as well. But when your RT3 is higher than your T3, or that ratio is out of balance from where it should be, you're not going to feel well. There's just no doubt about it. Factors that may inhibit production of thyroid hormone, again, stress, infection, toxins. We're going to touch on all of these. Autoimmune disease, again, like celiac disease, that's a huge one for thyroid disorders because, again, like if the gut plays such a huge role in that conversion, and it's essentially, our gut is our second brain, and it's our second immune system, and not our second, but our first immune system. If our gut isn't functioning properly, or we are overly permeable and we have this leaky gut syndrome, our immune system is going to exhibit some autoimmune type of characteristics, and that can express itself in a million different ways for each individual. Again, factors that increase the conversion of inactive T4 to T3, selenium and zinc. We have to make sure we're getting enough of that in our daily diet or in supplement form. That'll just ensure that whether you're taking, Synthro or Levo or whatever other medication you may be taking that is in reality most likely T4 inactive, we have to be sure that we're doing everything that we can to support that conversion to active T3, whether that be taking care of our liver or taking care of our gut or providing the nutrients needed. The other thing is that RT3 and T3, they compete for the same binding sites on the cell. So if we're overly stressed, RT3 is going to take precedence over T3 on the cell membranes. That's why maybe from a blood standpoint, you may have numbers that look okay, but you're feeling terrible and lethargic all the time and chronically fatigued. RT3 may be taking up more cell receptor sites on the actual tissues themselves. So things to think about, but let's move forward here. So what's the real problem? I really do think that not just for thyroid disorders, but for a lot of disorders, that inflammation and toxic overload at the cellular level is an epidemic today. And there's definitely evidence to support that inflammation is at the heart of several conditions today. So what are the main drivers of cellular inflammation? So we have to understand that you've heard me say cell several times now, and that's going to be a theme here for the next few minutes, but we really are talking about cellular inflammation, not say inflammation of a knee or an elbow. We're talking about one of the 70 trillion different cells we have in our body. So what are the things that really drive inflammation at the cellular level? Number one would be sugar and refined processed foods. I'm not really going to get into that. I think that it's generally known that we should be eating as clean of foods as we possibly can. Look for non-GMO, look for organic. There's no doubt that these foods are going to be better for you than the boxed crappy foods that you probably see down the middle of Kroger. At least that's what's here in Oxford, Ohio, or whatever other grocery store you're in. We have to be looking for clean foods. Gluten is actually more a thyroid-specific driver of cellular inflammation, and it's not necessarily the gluten itself, but maybe the gliadin purging that's involved in gluten. Gliadin can actually compete for the thyroid receptor sites on cells, so it's important that if we are sure that we have a sensitivity or even a full-blown allergy to gluten, that we try to steer clear of that as much as possible. Glyphosate is actually, I'm going to talk about glyphosate and heavy metals because I think that these are probably the two that most people are unaware of and probably the most pertinent to what's going on with the thyroid gland. So heavy metals, like how could we possibly be exposed to heavy metals? There's obviously the acute exposures. The most common that I have seen myself and that I'm going to talk about are lead and mercury. Lead is one of those metals that is completely dangerous. It's completely toxic as well as mercury, but the number one source of lead, believe it or not, isn't necessarily an acute exposure. It's actually mom. So your mother, for example. During pregnancy, mom naturally loses bone, and lead has an affinity for calcium and bone. So as mom loses bone during pregnancy, out comes lead, and that can actually transmit into the fetal blood supply and transfer to the baby. So, and that's in utero, by the way. Same thing can happen with heavy metals. There's actually a study called the DRASH study that found that the number one source of mercury, for example, is dental amalgam fillings. So if you have silver fillings in your mouth, 50% of that is mercury, and they found that on autopsy that the amount of metal fillings found in a mother's mouth was proportional to the amount found in a fetus's brain. So these metals, lead and mercury, are neurotoxic, and not only can they be transferred in utero from, say, mom to baby, but that can happen through 4 different generations. So, for example, I may not have metal fillings in my mouth, but say my mother did, or say my grandmother did, or my great-grandmother did. That's how these things can travel through generationally, and this is something that a lot of people aren't looking at when it comes to a toxicity or a cellular inflammation standpoint. And the number one place that these things like to go is actually the hypothalamus pituitary. So that part of the brain that literally is the master controller of our hormone system. To go along with that, glyphosate, which is AKA Roundup, so the stuff that we're spraying all over our foods, and which is why I think that we should be looking for non-GMO and organic foods, but glyphosate can actually act like a chelator to heavy metals. So say we do have some lead toxicity or we have some mercury toxicity. If we're eating a diet or we're being exposed to excessive levels of glyphosate, aka Roundup, Stephanie Seneff out of MIT, she's a senior research scientist, found in 2012 that glyphosate can actually take those heavy metals in the form of lead, mercury, even aluminum, and lodge them deeper into the brain tissue. So I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like fun, and it's definitely not a good thing. But I think that it's really the most upstream cause that we can get to when it comes to whether it be a thyroid disorder, other hormonal disorders, autoimmune disorders. This stuff is actually getting into our brains, which is essentially what runs everything in our body. And if we are not addressing this, then we're really downstream of where the problem actually is. So in general, we have to understand that we have to eat clean. Let's not eat the sugars and the refined processed foods. Get tested for gluten and celiac disease. And in my opinion, I think just stay away from it if you do have a thyroid disorder at the moment. Glyphosate and heavy metals, they have this synergistic relationship. The glyphosate, or aka Roundup, takes that lead and metals that we could possibly get from mom, or say the sources that we have in our body like dental amalgam fillings. It takes them and lodges them deeper into our brain. And then biotoxins, whether that be the form of infections and other things like that, like Lyme disease. I've seen that quite a bit lately. But in general, we have to understand that these things are generational, that they're most of the time hidden, and that we're not thinking about them. So, in matter of fact, I've had clients that their daughters or sons will be clients of mine, and we're helping them through whatever they're going through, whatever conditions they're trying to address naturally. And we will look at a metals profile of mom and child, and it will literally match up identically. And that just is more proof in the pudding that this stuff can travel through generationally. So, and mind you, those children who may be like 20, 22 years old, they don't have any immediate sources inside their body. So there's no other explanation other than they got that stuff from their mom. Okay? So sorry to all the moms out there, but that's just the truth. So let's go on here. In general, we're going to get into, inflammation is obviously at the root here, and a lot of these things are driving inflammation, whether it be metals or glyphosate or sugars, biotoxins and infection. To use thyroid as a perfect example of this, say we have some active T3, thyroid hormone, over here in the blood. The way that actually does its job or provides its benefit is by attaching to a receptor site you see there on the cell membrane. Once it does that, thyroid hormone can get inside the cell and do its thing, which is great. That's what's supposed to happen. But as a result of cell inflammation, and more importantly, we're actually talking about cell membrane inflammation, what essentially happens is the inflammation gets so bad at times that the receptor sites can actually become blunted. So you can see how, if that happens, you can have all kinds of thyroid hormone floating around in the blood, even if you're taking a medication, for example, and it's just not going to get inside the cell where it has to get in order for it to provide benefit. Okay? So in general, what do we have to do? I think that we definitely have to get upstream to the source of the issue, which is one, our brain, and then two, our cells. So we have to understand what's going on in the brain. Are there toxins in the brain? How do we get them out? And then two, we definitely have to look at this stuff from a cellular membrane perspective. So if you talk to a doctor, they may not get this stuff, but if you talk to any biochemist, any scientist, they understand that all this stuff has to happen at the cell. You have to take care of the body according to the cell, okay? So in general, this is going to be the most important slide that we really talk about here today. And we're going to talk about essentially detox and what we have to do to detox the brain and the body. So in general, like we talked about, you know, whether we're taking medications or hormones or minerals or vitamins or nutrients, toxins even, these things come from the blood. They get into our blood either via eating or putting things on the skin. One way or another, they'll find their way into the blood. The only way for them to have an effect in the body is to actually get onto one of these cell membranes receptors here. And once that happens, they get inside the cell and do all these wonderful things. For example, thyroid hormone, we will produce cellular energy in the form of ATP, which I won't get all sciencey on you, but that's just the cellular form of energy. We will produce, say, glutathione, which is our master detox agent. And as a result of just producing cellular energy, just like burning gasoline in a car, we're going to produce some exhaust as waste. So the same thing happens inside the cell. We produce energy and we produce cellular waste. And usually, in a normal, healthy individual, we will get rid of that waste via the lymphatics, the kidneys, the liver, and eventually the gut, and eventually into the can. Okay? You can do the math down here. But because of the cell membrane inflammation that's going on, you can see, you can see that when these receptors get blunted, not only can the good guys not get in the cell, but once this cell membrane inflammation is so bad, the bad guys can't get out. Okay, so we kind of have, you know, an analogy I like to use that, say we're in not a very well ventilated room and we start a fire in the room. Eventually, we're probably not going to survive in that room because the smoke is going to get so bad because there's nowhere for it to go. So if you imagine each cell, especially if we're inflamed and the good guys aren't getting in, the bad guys aren't getting out, as a not very well ventilated room, and we're just producing all this smoke and waste, you know, if that's what's going on, then we're in a world of hurt because now, you know, our genes aren't doing the right thing. We can actually turn our genes on and off, believe it or not. It's called epigenetics. So if we have this inflammation going on, we are really suffering from the cellular perspective. So in general, you know, detox has to happen at the cellular level. It's necessary for, you know, all processes of the body to thrive. But while it does have to happen at the cellular level, it also has to happen in the brain as well. Remember, the main drivers of inflammation we talked about, whether it be metals or refined foods, glutens, things like that, they all can get into the brain as well. So our brain actually detoxes to our liver. Okay, so the upstream sources here are the brain and the cell. Okay, so I'm not against the typical cleanses that we see, like the colon cleanses, the liver cleanses, the colon cleanses, but understand that if you look at this diagram, those are all downstream of where the real problem is actually lying. Okay, the real problem actually lies in the cell membrane, addressing the toxicity and inflammation there, and then more importantly, addressing the toxicity and inflammation in the brain. Okay. So what do we have to do? We do have to upregulate our cell energy. I have done several videos and a recent webinar on the ketogenic diet and how to burn fat for fuel, but understand that if we're able to burn more fat for fuel, or at least we're able to cellularly burn fat for fuel, we're going to be in a lot better place from an inflammatory perspective than we would be if we were only able to burn sugar and carbs. So in general, we're looking at reducing our sugar intake so we can burn more fat for fuel, and that'll reduce the inflammatory load that we have on the cells. That's just step one, right? So consider the following. So we have to cut out sugar and grains, I think, at least for a time. Focus on non-GMO whenever possible. We get plenty of wild-caught fish. I love sockeye salmon. Look for the good healthy fats, avocados, olives. Believe it or not, coconut oil isn't poison, and I don't think it'll kill you for the most part. Get plenty of dark cooked leafy greens, especially if you're eating, say, cruciferous veggies like cauliflower, broccoli, kale, collards. Those guys probably should be cooked because they can be gorgogenic if raw, which is never a good recipe, I think, for thyroid issues. Look for the wild-caught, grass-fed, pasture-raised meats and eggs if you do meats. Consider these as supplementation. Turmeric is a great anti-inflammatory, especially when you take it in combination with some sort of fat and some sort of spice like black pepper. Get plenty of vitamin D3, and I probably should have put K2 on here as well. You want to be sure that you're taking D3 and K2 and vitamin A and vitamin E, aka the fat-soluble vitamins, in the right ratios, because if you just remember nothing other than that the cell membrane is important and that there are receptor sites for all of these things. The same receptor site is used for vitamin D3 as is K2 and A and E. So we have to be sure that we're getting these things in the right ratios so our body knows what to do with it, rather than just taking, straight D3 all the time and essentially possibly creating a deficiency in vitamins A, E, and K2 by doing so. Magnesium is actually something that's very much needed in the conversion of T4 to T3 thyroid hormone, getting that hormone into the active form. I love adaptogenic herbs like ashwagandha, rhodiola rosea, and maca root. Ashwagandha has actually been clinically studied to improve the thyroid gland. And adaptogen is just, if you're unfamiliar with that term, it essentially is a balancing agent. So, for example, if your thyroid hormones are high, if you're a hyperactive thyroid guy or gal, it'll bring it down into balance. If you're an underactive or a hypothyroid guy or gal, it'll bring it up to balance. So it doesn't push it necessarily too high or too low. It tries to get balance into the body. Collagen supplementation. I say that because it's great for the gut. Remember that conversion happens inside the gut. At least part of it does. So we do have to take care of that gut lining and try to heal up some leaky gut. And then I also love a supplement called Restore for Gut Health. That's great for leaky gut as well, and sealing up those tight junctions, or AKA the holes that you see that have been poked from leaky gut. So, and get tested. So you can do this several ways. You can ask your primary care doctor, or you can go like to a self-serve site like Direct Labs or LabCorp. But in general, I feel like we do have to take a global look. Most people are just looking at TSH and T4, and that's just not even half of the picture. We do need to look at antibodies to make sure that we're not having an autoimmune type of thyroid issue. We need to look at free T3 and free T4. We need to look at reverse T3, and then we need to look at ratios of those as well. So get tested. If you're in doubt, if you feel like you may have a thyroid issue, contact your primary care doctor and see if you can get tested and get all of these tests run. Or if you want to go the solo route, you can try the Direct Labs or LabCorp. It's up to you. Basal body temperature is actually a way you can test to see if you have a possible thyroid problem. It's kind of old-fashioned, but in general, you would need a old-fashioned mercury thermometer. Our basal body temperature is normally around 97.8 to 98.2. Anything around mid 97s or below is probably going to be a pretty decent indication that you have an underactive thyroid. Think cold hands and feet. That's a pretty common symptom for folks with thyroid disorders. So how can we help? Hopefully you benefited from this webinar. Our website is GillespieFamilyChiro.com. We do nutritional consulting, as well as obviously chiropractic care. We often get the question, if we're not local, can we still do a consultation? Yes, you can. I do that often. We have people from California call us. We have people from New York call us, and we help those folks out. So if you are watching this video and you're not local, say in the Oxford, Ohio, or greater Cincinnati area of Ohio, but you're somewhere else, we would still be willing to talk to you and try to help you. All you have to do is give us a call, and everything that you need to know will be at GillespieFamilyChiro.com. So hope you guys enjoy this webinar. I always enjoy doing these, so if you guys have any questions, feel free to shoot us an email or a call, in addition to shooting out some comments either on the Facebook page that we're going to post this on, or the YouTube page as well. You can go to Dr. Brad Gillespie on YouTube. I've done several videos now on various different topics. But look, you guys, people need to know this information. People need to know that detox is a big part of a lot of health conditions. We're actually going to be launching a detox program here very soon, so stay tuned for that. But share this information, like it, post it, whatever you want to do with it. Just get the information out there, and thank you for watching.